Welcome to this story about one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in the history of Pensacola. Before we start, I'd like you to leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. We want to know where these stories reach and what times people are listening. The year was 1837 when a woman disappeared. Pensacola, in the Florida Territory, was still getting used to being part of America. Spain had given up control of the city just 16 years earlier. This port city, with its important harbor on the Gulf of Mexico, had a special character. Spanish buildings and customs still existed alongside new American ways, making it feel like a place stuck between two worlds. This mixing of cultures went beyond just the way things looked. It affected how people in the community felt and acted. About 3 miles north of town, along Escambia Bay, stood Magnolia Hill, the Layton plantation house. Tall white columns decorated the front, making it look like a wealthy southern home, but these columns hid the darkness within. The property covered nearly 400 acres of pine forests, cotton fields, and swampy lands that stretched toward the water. It was on November 12th of that year, during an unusually cold autumn, that Lenora Duvalier was reported missing from the Layton plantation. What happened when she disappeared would remain a mystery whispered about for over 100 years until documents were found in 1963 that shed disturbing light on what may have happened. According to public records from that time, Lenora Duvalier was listed as a 24-year-old free woman of color from New Orleans. She had been working as a house servant at Magnolia Hill for about 6 months before she disappeared. However, this was just the official story, a convenient explanation that satisfied local police enough to close their quick investigation after just 2 weeks. The property belonged to Tobias Layton, a 42-year-old widower who had inherited the plantation from his father-in-law after his wife died during childbirth 3 years earlier. People who wrote about Layton at the time described him as an educated man with refined tastes, but he had a distant personality that kept people from getting too close. He lived alone with his 3-year-old daughter, Eleanor, and a household staff of 15 enslaved people and 2 free employees, including Lenora. When asked about the disappearance, Layton said that Lenora had simply not shown up for work one morning. Her personal belongings were still in her room, including a silver locket containing a tiny portrait of a woman thought to be her mother. No one said they saw her leave. No one admitted to hearing anything unusual the night before. The investigation concluded that she had probably run away. Even though she left all her possessions behind, the case might have been forgotten as just a small note in local records if documents hadn't been discovered during repairs to the old Pensacola courthouse in 1963, hidden inside a sealed compartment in a desk that once belonged to Judge William Patterson, who ran the territorial court in 1837, was a leather folder containing private letters, unofficial witness statements, and the judge's personal notes on several cases, including Lenora's disappearance. What follows is a story rebuilt from these documents and other historical records that paint a much more disturbing picture of what happened at Magnolia Hill. As we piece together this story, remember that these events happened during the darkest parts of American history, in places where human dignity was routinely violated, and where certain truths were deliberately kept secret. The first strange thing noted in Judge Patterson's private papers was that Lenora Duvalier had not asked for a job at Magnolia Hill. Instead, she had arrived there under circumstances that even the judge found troubling. According to a letter from Patterson's cousin in New Orleans, Lenora had been living as a free woman of color in the French Quarter, working as a seamstress with respectable customers. Her sudden departure for Pensacola had surprised her friends, especially since she had recently become engaged to a carpenter named Martin Beaufort. Patterson's notes showed that Lenora had received a letter, supposedly from a maternal aunt living in Pensacola who claimed to be very sick and needed Lenora to come. When Lenora arrived in Pensacola, however, she discovered that the address given belonged to a boarding house where no such aunt had ever lived. With her money used up by the journey, and finding herself stranded in an unfamiliar city, she asked local authorities for help. This is when Tobias Layton entered the story. Judge Patterson's notes mentioned that Layton happened to be doing business at the courthouse when Lenora arrived asking for help. He offered her temporary work at his plantation until she could earn enough money to return to New Orleans. The judge wrote that he found the coincidence too convenient to believe, but without evidence of wrongdoing. He didn't investigate further. What Judge Patterson couldn't have known then, but what his later letters suggest he came to suspect, was that Lenora's arrival in Pensacola was no accident at all. Among the discovered papers was a draft of a letter from Leighton to a business contact in New Orleans dated 2 months before Lenora's arrival. In it, Leighton asked about a certain seamstress of mixed race, said to have extraordinary skills and refined manners, who visited the shop of Madame Rousseau on Royal Street. The description matched what was known about Lenora and her customers. The first few weeks of Lenora's work at Magnolia Hill seemed normal, at least according to the official household record book that tracked the duties and performance of staff. She was assigned to care for Leighton's young daughter, Eleanor, and to mend household linens. The record described her as hardworking, proper in behavior, and having a calming effect on the child. However, a different story emerges from the incomplete journal of Martha Lewis, an elderly enslaved woman who worked in the kitchen at Magnolia Hill. 3 pages of this journal, written in barely readable handwriting on scraps of paper and sewn into the lining of a kitchen apron, were discovered during an inventory of artifacts donated to the Pensacola Historical Society in 1958. The donor, an elderly woman named Sarah Jenkins, claimed to be the granddaughter of Martha Lewis and had kept the apron as a family treasure, unaware of what was hidden inside until the fabric began to fall apart. Martha's writing suggests that Lenora's position in the household was immediately complicated by Leighton's unusual attention. The master watches the New Orleans woman when she tends to the child, one entry reads. He stands in doorways and behind curtains. His eyes follow her movements in a way that makes the house staff uncomfortable. The child, however, has grown attached to her, calling for Nora, even in her sleep. Another entry, dated about 1 month after Lenora's arrival, states, the master ordered that Miss Lenora's room be moved from the servants' wing to the room next to the nursery, saying it would let her better care for the child during the night. The room used to be the mistress's dressing room and still has many of her personal things. Miss Lenora seemed troubled by the arrangement but didn't openly object. Martha's journal also records increasing tension within the household. Miss Lenora asked permission to send letters to New Orleans. The master denied this request, saying that all household mail must go through him to ensure the security of his business affairs. She didn't bring up the matter again in my presence, but her behavior has changed. She watches the roads whenever she takes the child for walks in the garden. The most disturbing entry, dated just 1 week before Lenora's disappearance, reads, Miss Lenora confided in me today while collecting herbs from the kitchen garden. She believes the master intercepted a letter sent to her from New Orleans. She seemed very distressed and mentioned a fiancé who would surely come looking for her. She asked if I knew of anyone traveling to Mobile who might carry a message for her. I was forced to say no, knowing the punishment that would follow such an action. She touched my hand in understanding, but the fear in her eyes has stayed with me through my prayers. This final journal entry suggests that Lenora was not planning to run away, but was instead trying to contact her fiancé in New Orleans, possibly to arrange her departure from Magnolia Hill. This contradicts Leighton's claim to investigators that Lenora had given no sign of being unhappy with her position. Night before Lenora's disappearance was the same night as a dinner party hosted by Leighton for several important Pensacola businessmen. According to household records, the gathering ended around midnight with all guests leaving except for Dr. Alexander Wilson, who reportedly stayed behind to discuss a medical matter with Leighton. Dr. Wilson would later become a person of interest in Judge Patterson's unofficial investigation. The doctor said that he left Magnolia Hill shortly after the other guests, around 12:30, and rode directly to his home in Pensacola. However, a statement given to Patterson by Isaiah Cooper, a fisherman who was setting crab traps in Escambia Bay that night, contradicted this story. Cooper claimed that around 2 in the morning, he saw a carriage matching the description of Dr. Wilson's traveling away from the direction of Magnolia Hill on the rarely used North Bayshore Road. The carriage moved slowly, as if carrying something heavy, and stopped briefly at a wooden bridge crossing a creek that fed into the bay. Cooper said he saw a man who looked like Dr. Wilson get out of the carriage, lean over the bridge railing for several minutes, and then continue his journey toward town. When confronted with this testimony by Patterson in an unofficial way, Dr. Wilson changed his statement to say that he had indeed taken the longer Bayshore route home because the main road was muddy from recent rains, and I feared for my horse's footing in the darkness. He denied stopping at any point during the journey. No further action was taken regarding this inconsistency, as Patterson didn't have official grounds to pursue the matter. The morning after the dinner party, Lenora was discovered to be missing from her room. Eleanor Layton, the 3-year-old child, was found alone in her nursery, unusually quiet. When household staff asked about Lenora's whereabouts, Tobias Layton reportedly said that she had expressed unhappiness the previous evening and had likely returned to New Orleans. When reminded that her belongings were still in her room, he suggested that she would send for them once settled. The local sheriff, James Miller, conducted a brief investigation at Layton's request. His official report noted nothing suspicious about the property. He questioned the household staff but recorded no important statements. The report concluded, "It appears the woman, Lenora Duvalier, has left of her own free will, perhaps fearing the consequences of some unrevealed misconduct. No evidence of foul play was discovered, and Mr. Layton expresses only concern for her welfare, having regarded her as a dependable employee." Sheriff Miller's investigation might have been the end of the matter, had it not been for a curious incident that occurred 3 weeks later. According to an account in Judge Patterson's papers, he was approached by Elizabeth Wilson, the wife of Dr. Alexander Wilson, who requested a private meeting. During this meeting, she presented the judge with a woman's nightgown that she claimed to have discovered hidden beneath the floorboards of her husband's study. The nightgown, described as finely made of white linen with delicate embroidery at the collar, had dark stains that Mrs. Wilson believed to be blood. More disturbingly, she had found tucked into its folds a silver locket, containing a miniature portrait, a locket matching the description of the one left behind in Lenora's room at Magnolia Hill. Judge Patterson recorded that he advised Mrs. Wilson to return the items to their hiding place and to mention the discovery to no one, not even her husband. He promised to look into the matter carefully. However, before he could investigate further, Elizabeth Wilson was found dead in her bathtub, an apparent suicide by drowning. Dr. Wilson reported that his wife had been suffering from nervous exhaustion and delusions for several months. The locket and nightgown were never recovered or mentioned in any official documents. Judge Patterson's notes show that he visited the Wilson home after Elizabeth's funeral, but found no trace of the items. Dr. Wilson later sold his Pensacola practice and moved to Mobile, Alabama. In the months following Lenora's disappearance, life at Magnolia Hill seemed to return to normal. Layton hired a new nursemaid for his daughter, an older woman from a respected local family. He expanded his business interests, investing in a shipping venture with partners in Mobile. By all accounts, he remained a respected, if somewhat reserved member of Pensacola society. Yet subtle changes were noted by those who knew the household. Martha Lewis's apron contained one final hidden note dated 6 months after Lenora's disappearance. The child no longer speaks. The master says she is merely being stubborn, but I have seen her staring at the door to her former nurse's room, her small face blank as unfired clay. At night, she often wakes screaming, though no sound passes her lips. The master has forbidden anyone from entering the room where Miss Lenora stayed. He keeps the key on his person at all times. This silence on the part of young Eleanor Layton would prove to be more than temporary. Historical records show that she never spoke another word for the rest of her life. She was eventually sent to a boarding school in Charleston at age 8, where teachers described her as intelligent but unable or unwilling to communicate except through writing. She returned to Magnolia Hill only after her father's death in 1852, inheriting the property but living there as a recluse. Managed by trustees until her own death in 1891. Eleanor Layton died unmarried and childless at age 57. Her will contained unusual instructions. The plantation house was to be immediately torn down, its materials sold and the money donated to an orphanage in New Orleans. The land was to remain empty for 50 years, after which it could be sold, with the rule that no building could ever be constructed within 100 yards of where the main house had stood. These strange requirements were followed by her trustees, though they caused much speculation in the community. The demolition crew reported finding strange modifications to the house during their work, a hidden room accessible only through a concealed door in the master bedroom, closet containing nothing but a small child's rocking chair and several scratches on the wall at about the height of an adult's fingertips. For decades, the former site of Magnolia Hill remained empty, gradually taken over by pine forest and undergrowth. Local children told stories of hearing a woman's crying among the trees, though such tales are common for many abandoned properties throughout the South. More unusual was how strongly locals avoided the property even after restrictions on its use expired in the 1940s. Developers who showed interest in the land often withdrew their offers after visiting the site, citing various practical concerns, but sometimes admitting to an unexplainable feeling of heaviness that came over them there. In 1959, during the construction of a highway that would pass near the former Magnolia Hill property, workers dredging a section of the creek that crossed the land made a disturbing discovery. Beneath the remains of an old wooden bridge, caught in decades of mud and preserved by the brackish water, they found human remains. The skeleton was determined to be that of a woman in her 20s with evidence of West African ancestry. A metal object had become fused to the chest bones through years of rust, a corroded silver locket. The remains were examined by Dr. Harold Jeffries of the University of Florida, who determined that the woman had suffered a severe fracture to the base of the skull before entering the water. In his report, he stated, "The nature of the injury is consistent with a forceful blow from behind with a heavy blunt object. The fracture pattern suggests the person was likely facing away from her attacker at the time of impact. Death would have been immediate, or nearly so." Due to the age of the remains and the impossibility of establishing a definite identity using the forensic techniques available in 1959, the case was not reopened. The bones were stored in the university's anthropology department until 1967, when they were transferred to the Smithsonian Institution for further study as part of a larger research project on historical demographics. It was only after the discovery of Judge Patterson's papers in 1963 that connections began to be made between the remains found at the creek and the long-forgotten case of Lenora Duvalier. Researchers noted the match between the location of the discovery beneath a bridge on the Bayshore Road and Isaiah Cooper's statement about seeing Dr. Wilson's carriage stop at that very bridge on the night of Lenora's disappearance. Further investigation into historical records revealed additional disturbing details. Dr. Alexander Wilson, after moving to Mobile, had married 3 more times. All 3 wives died under circumstances that, while not obviously suspicious when viewed individually, formed a troubling pattern when considered together. One from a fall downstairs, one from an apparent accidental poisoning with medicinal laudanum, and one from drowning during a seaside holiday. Wilson himself died in 1871 from what was recorded as apoplexy, likely a stroke. As for Tobias Layton, his life after Lenora's disappearance was outwardly successful but marked by oddities. He never remarried, though his social position and wealth would have made him an eligible widower. Household accounts show that he frequently traveled to New Orleans on business, often returning with expensive gifts for his silent daughter. During the final years of his life, he became increasingly reclusive, rarely leaving Magnolia Hill and dismissing much of his household staff. The most intriguing document discovered among Judge Patterson's papers was a sealed letter addressed to the judge from Tobias Layton, dated just 1 week before Layton's death in 1852. The letter, which Patterson apparently never opened, contained a full confession. In this remarkable document, Layton admitted to arranging Lenora's arrival in Pensacola through false letters. He described becoming obsessed with her after seeing her in New Orleans during a business trip, convinced that she looked strikingly like his deceased wife. His intention, he claimed, had been only to have her care for his daughter, to keep some shadow of his wife's presence in the household. But closeness bred greater madness, he wrote. "I convinced myself that she returned my affections, though she clearly did not. When I discovered her attempt to contact her fiancé in New Orleans, I realized she planned to leave. I could not bear the thought of losing her, of losing my wife a second time, as my delusion had reconstructed the situation." According to Layton's confession, on the night of the dinner party, he confronted Lenora after the guests had left, declaring his feelings and proposing marriage. When she refused him and tried to leave the room, he struck her in a moment of rage, causing her to fall and hit her head against a marble fireplace hearth. Believing her dead or dying, he panicked and asked for help from Dr. Wilson, who had stayed behind. Wilson, seeing my distress, offered assistance in exchange for my silence regarding certain improprieties I had witnessed in his professional conduct. Layton wrote, "Together, we wrapped her body in bed sheets and carried her to his carriage. He assured me he would dispose of her remains in a way that would never be discovered. I did not ask about his methods, preferring ignorance to further guilt. The confession continued with a chilling revelation. It was only when Wilson returned some hours later that I learned the full horror of what had happened. Lenora had not been dead when we moved her. She had woken up during the journey, causing Wilson to panic and strike her with his medical bag before throwing her, still breathing, from the bridge. He described her attempts to cling to the bridge supports, her fingers scraping the wood as he pried them loose. The current, he assured me, had taken her body out toward the bay. Leighton concluded his confession with a reference to his daughter. Eleanor witnessed everything from the shadows of the hallway. She has not spoken since that night. Her eyes hold the judgment I deserve, but have so far escaped in this world. I write this confession knowing my days are few, hoping that some measure of justice might yet be served, though I myself will have passed beyond its reach. The confession, had it been delivered and read, might have led to a posthumous investigation of both Leighton and Dr. Wilson. Instead, sealed and forgotten in Judge Patterson's desk, it remained hidden until 1963, by which time all main figures in the case had long since died. The story of Lenora Duvalier and the tragedy at Magnolia Hill represents more than just an isolated incident of violence. It serves as a stark reminder of the broader systems of oppression that allowed such events to occur and remain largely unaddressed. The vulnerability of free people of color in the antebellum South, the complicity of authority figures in maintaining a veneer of propriety over unspeakable acts, and the generational trauma inflicted by such violence, all are elements of this historical narrative that continue to resonate. Today, the former site of Magnolia Hill is part of a nature preserve. A small marker erected in 2002 by a local historical society acknowledges the presence of the plantation without mentioning the specific events that happened there. Visitors occasionally report an unusual heaviness in the air around the area where the main house once stood, particularly during the early morning hours when mist rises from the creek. Researchers attempting to locate descendants of Lenora Duvalier have so far been unsuccessful. Records from New Orleans show that her fiancé, Martin Beaufort, made inquiries with authorities in Pensacola regarding her disappearance, but was given the same explanation provided to local officials, that she had likely continued on to Mobile or points further west. Beaufort eventually married another woman and relocated to Haiti in 1840, perhaps carrying with him unanswered questions about Lenora's fate. As for Eleanor Leighton, her decades of silence remain the most moving testimony to the events at Magnolia Hill. Journals kept during her adult years, preserved in the University of West Florida archives, reveal a woman of considerable intelligence and sensitivity. Though she never directly mentioned the events surrounding Lenora's disappearance, her writings frequently return to themes of guilt, witness, and the weight of unspoken truths. In one entry dated 1870, she wrote, "There are spaces between words where entire worlds exist. In these spaces I have lived my life. What cannot be spoken shapes us more deeply than what can. The silence after a scream continues to echo long after the sound itself has died away." Perhaps the most fitting ending for Lenora Duvalier comes from Eleanor's final journal entry, written just days before her death. "I have arranged for the house to be torn down. May the earth reclaim what rightfully belongs to it. But I know that structures made of wood and stone are not the only places where horror lives. Some houses are built in memory, their foundations laid in the moments that divide our lives into before and after. These cannot be demolished by any earthly means. They stand as monuments to all we could not save, all we failed to protect." I go to my grave, still hearing the sounds from that night. A woman's pleas, a door closing, footsteps fading down the hall, and after, the silence that has defined my existence. The case of Lenora Duvalier was officially closed in 1963 when Judge Patterson's papers were sealed in the state archives, deemed too historically sensitive for public access. They were finally made available to researchers in 1989, by which time the events they described had passed beyond living memory into the realm of history. Yet the emotional impact of this tragedy continues to resonate, reminding us that the past is never truly silent for those willing to listen. In the shadowed corners of America's history, Countless stories like Lenora's remain untold or incomplete, their details lost to time or deliberately obscured. It is only through the patient work of historical investigation and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths that we can begin to acknowledge the full human cost of our shared past. As you walk away from this narrative, consider the spaces between the facts presented, the silences that speak volumes, and the echoes that continue to reverberate through time. For in these forgotten histories lie lessons still unlearned, wounds still unhealed, and voices that, though silenced, still demand to be heard. The discovery of human remains beneath the old bridge in 1959 prompted several locals to come forward with stories passed down through generations. Among these was Howard Jenkins, grandson of Sarah Jenkins, who had donated Martha Lewis's apron to the Historical Society. Howard shared a story told by his grandmother about strange occurrences at Magnolia Hill in the years following Lenora's disappearance. According to this oral history, the room that had belonged to Lenora remained locked for years, but servants occasionally reported hearing sounds from within, soft scratching and what some described as whispered counting. When Eleanor Layton returned to the plantation after her father's death, her first act was to enter this room, spending 3 days inside without coming out for food or water. When she finally emerged, she ordered all furniture removed and the walls painted black. The room thereafter remained empty but unlocked, and Eleanor would sometimes be found sitting on its floor, writing in her journal by candlelight. Another account came from Thomas Mercer, whose great-grandfather had been part of the demolition crew that tore down Magnolia Hill following Eleanor's death. Mercer claimed that his ancestor had discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of Lenora's room containing dozens of folded paper birds, each inscribed with a single word. When arranged in a particular order, these words reportedly formed a message. She watches from the water. Her eyes never close. The child knows. The credibility of such second-hand accounts is naturally questionable, especially given the tendency toward embellishment in oral histories. However, certain physical evidence lends credence to at least some elements of these stories. During an archaeological survey of the former Magnolia Hill property conducted in 1977, researchers discovered beneath the soil where Lenora's room would have stood a small metal box containing a child's diary. The diary, confirmed through handwriting analysis to belong to young Eleanor Layton, contained entries spanning from just before Lenora's arrival at Magnolia Hill until approximately 1 week after her disappearance. The final entries are particularly disturbing, written in an increasingly erratic hand. November 10th, 1837. Miss Nora showed me how to make birds from paper today. She says each one can carry a wish or a secret. I made one with my wish to visit the ocean someday. She made one too, but wouldn't tell me what she wished. November 11th, 1837. Father is having guests tonight. Miss Nora seems afraid. She told me to stay in my room no matter what sounds I might hear. She gave me her locket to hold until morning and made me promise to remember her always. November 12th, 1837. Miss Nora screamed in the night. I looked through the keyhole and saw Father and Dr. Wilson carrying something wrapped in sheets. There was red on the floor that Martha cleaned before sunrise. Father says Miss Nora has gone away, but her locket is still in my hand. November 13th, 1837. I saw Miss Nora last night standing at the foot of my bed. Her hair was wet and water dripped onto my quilt. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. Her eyes looked so sad. I tried to give back her locket, but my hand passed through her hand. The final entry, dated November 19th, consists of a single line. The words won't come anymore. They stay inside where it's safe. Eleanor's childhood diary represents one of the few contemporary accounts of the events surrounding Lenora's disappearance. Its discovery prompted renewed interest in the case among historians specializing in antebellum Southern history, particularly those focused on crimes against free people of color that often went uninvestigated or were deliberately covered up. Dr. Marianne Winters, professor of historical criminology at Tulane University, conducted extensive research into the Magnolia Hill case during the 1980s. Her work included analyzing court records, property deeds, medical reports, and other documents from Pensacola and surrounding areas during the relevant time period. Her findings, published in 1987, shed additional light on the circumstances that enabled such a crime to occur and remain largely concealed. According to Dr. Winter's research, Tobias Layton and Dr. Alexander Wilson were not merely acquaintances, but had financial ties dating back several years before Lenora's disappearance. Wilson had treated Layton's wife during her fatal childbirth and subsequently became involved in Layton's shipping business, investing a substantial sum that helped establish a trade route between Pensacola and New Orleans. More significantly, Dr. Winters discovered records indicating that Wilson had been investigated for medical malpractice in Virginia before relocating to Florida Territory. The case involved the death of a young woman under his care, with allegations that he had administered improper treatment and then altered records to conceal his error. Though never formally charged, Wilson left Virginia shortly after the investigation began, reinventing himself in Pensacola as a respected physician. The relationship between Layton and Wilson appears to have been one of mutual compromise, Dr. Winters wrote. Each man possessed knowledge that could damage the other's reputation and standing. This dynamic created a dangerous alliance that ultimately facilitated their collaboration in Lenora Duvalier's death and the subsequent cover-up. The 1980s also saw attempts to locate any surviving relatives of Lenora Duvalier in New Orleans. Genealogists traced records of the Duvalier family, discovering that Lenora had been born to a French merchant father and a mother who had been formerly enslaved, but gained her freedom when Lenora was an infant. Both parents died in a yellow fever epidemic when Lenora was 17, leaving her to support herself through her skills as a seamstress. Further research revealed that Lenora's fiancé, Martin Beaufort, had indeed made inquiries in Pensacola regarding her disappearance. A letter from Beaufort to the territorial governor dated February 1838 was discovered in state archives. In it, he expressed dissatisfaction with the local investigation and requested a more thorough inquiry, noting that Lenora had written to him expressing unease about her situation at Magnolia Hill just 2 weeks before her disappearance. The governor's response, if there was one, has not been preserved. However, court records show that Beaufort filed a civil claim against Tobias Layton in March 1838, alleging wrongful detention and seeking information about Lenora's whereabouts. The case was dismissed by Judge Patterson on grounds of insufficient evidence, with the notation that the plaintiff, being a man of color, lacked standing to bring such charges against a property owner of Mr. Layton's stature without more substantial proof of wrongdoing. This legal barrier, the dismissal of Beaufort's legitimate concerns, based partly on his racial status, exemplifies the systemic injustices that allowed crimes against free people of color to go unpunished throughout the antebellum South. Even when evidence existed, as in Lenora's case, social and legal structures often protected white perpetrators while denying justice to victims and their families. Beaufort's subsequent departure for Haiti takes on new significance in this context. Having exhausted legal channels in his search for Lenora, and perhaps facing increasing hostility from those who wished the matter forgotten, he chose exile in a nation founded by formerly enslaved people rather than continue living under a system that denied him both answers and justice. Another dimension of the Magnolia Hill tragedy emerged in 1992, when marine archaeologists surveying Escambia Bay discovered the remains of a 19th-century sailing vessel approximately half a mile from the mouth of the creek where Lenora's remains were found. The vessel, identified as the Caroline Marie based on recovered artifacts, had belonged to Tobias Layton and was reported lost in a storm in 1840. However, examination of the wreckage suggested that the ship had been deliberately sunk rather than lost to natural causes. Most intriguingly, in a sealed compartment in the captain's cabin, divers found a collection of women's clothing and personal items dating from the late 1830s, including several garments matching the style and approximate size that Lenora would have worn. The presence of these items aboard Layton's vessel raised new questions about his mental state in the years following Lenora's death. Dr. Catherine Reynolds, a forensic psychologist consulted during the investigation of the wreckage, suggested that Layton may have been experiencing what modern psychology would classify as severe, obsessive-compulsive behavior coupled with delusional thinking. The evidence suggests that Layton may have created a shrine of sorts to Lenora aboard his vessel, Dr. Reynolds noted in her assessment. The careful preservation of clothing and personal effects, hidden away where no one else would discover them, indicates both obsessive attachment and awareness of the inappropriateness of this fixation. The deliberate sinking of the vessel could represent a ritualistic attempt at closure, or conversely, a means of ensuring that his secret obsession remained permanently hidden. This psychological analysis aligns with accounts from Leighton's business associates during his final years. Several letters preserved in the Pensacola Maritime Museum collection describe increasingly erratic behavior, including paranoid accusations that employees were entering his private quarters without permission, and claims that he could hear a woman's voice calling from the bay on still nights. In his final year of life, Leighton reportedly refused to travel by water, even though doing so significantly complicated his business affairs. His last will and testament, beyond providing for Eleanor's care, contained unusual provisions requiring that his body be interred in a lead-lined coffin to ensure that water shall never touch my remains. This specific fear seems particularly significant, given Lenora's fate, Eleanor Leighton's lifelong silence following her childhood. Trauma presents one of the most poignant aspects of this historical case. Medical records from the Charleston boarding school she attended indicate that physicians examined her extensively, finding no physical cause for her inability to speak. One doctor noted that she would occasionally open her mouth as if to talk, only to close it again with an expression of terror. Despite her silence, Eleanor found other means of expression. Her education was primarily conducted through written correspondence with teachers, and she demonstrated remarkable aptitude in mathematics and botany. Several botanical illustrations she produced during her schooling are now held in the Charleston Museum, showing exceptional attention to detail, particularly in her renderings of aquatic plants. After returning to Pensacola following her father's death, Eleanor lived as a recluse on the plantation property but maintained extensive written correspondence with several notable scientists and authors of the period. Her letters reveal a keen intellect and dry wit that contrast sharply with her public reputation as a tragic, damaged figure. In one exchange with naturalist John Bartram, she wrote, "Silence, once embraced, offers certain advantages. The world speaks endlessly, revealing its nature without prompting. One needs only to listen." Eleanor never married, but historical records indicate that in the 1860s she invited a distant cousin, Margaret Leighton, to live at Magnolia Hill as a companion. The two women shared the increasingly dilapidated house until Eleanor's death. Margaret's journals, discovered among family papers in 1974, provide insights into Eleanor's daily life and unusual habits. According to Margaret, Eleanor spent hours each day sitting by the creek where Lenora's remains would eventually be discovered. Though neither woman knew of their presence there, Eleanor would bring paper and charcoal, appearing to sketch, though she would destroy her drawings immediately upon completion. She also maintained a strict ritual of placing fresh flowers in Lenora's former room every Sunday. Though she never explained the significance of this practice to Margaret, most revealing is Margaret's account of Eleanor's night terrors. She wakes in the darkest hours, her mouth open in what would be a scream were she capable of sound, Margaret wrote. When I come to her, she writes the same words on her slate. She's standing in the corner again. Her hair is still wet after all these years. I have learned to simply sit with her until dawn breaks, as no comfort I can offer seems to dispel her conviction that we are not alone in the room. These night terrors reportedly intensified in the months leading up to Eleanor's death in 1891. Margaret's final entries describe Eleanor becoming increasingly agitated, insisting on sleeping in the chair by her window rather than in her bed, with a view of the creek visible in the distance. On the night before her death, Eleanor allegedly wrote a message that she insisted Margaret burn without reading. Margaret admitted to glimpsing the first line before committing the paper to flames. I have kept your secret for 54 years, but I can no longer bear the weight of silence. Eleanor died in her sleep that night at age 57. The cause was recorded as heart failure, though modern medical historians have suggested that the cumulative effects of psychological trauma may have contributed to her physical decline. Margaret supervised the demolition of Magnolia Hill as stipulated in Eleanor's will, then returned to her family in Virginia, carrying with her the untold stories of her years at the plantation. The demolition of Magnolia Hill effectively erased the physical setting of Lenora's tragedy from the landscape, but could not eliminate its psychological impact on the community. For decades afterward, local residents avoided the property, particularly after dark, Fishermen reported hearing a woman's voice calling from the vicinity of the old bridge, especially during autumn nights when the temperature dropped suddenly, as it had on the night of Lenora's disappearance. Such folklore might be dismissed as typical ghost stories that often attach themselves to sites of tragedy, but the consistency of certain details across multiple accounts is noteworthy. Many unrelated witnesses described the same phenomena: the sound of water dripping where no water was present, a sudden chill that affected only a specific area near the creek, and the faint smell of lavender, known to have been Lenora's preferred scent, according to household records from Magnolia Hill. In 1979, an attempt to develop the property into a residential subdivision failed after several construction workers refused to continue, citing unexplained equipment failures and a persistent feeling of being watched. The project was ultimately abandoned, and the land was later incorporated into a nature preserve, perhaps the most fitting memorial for a woman whose life was cut short by human cruelty, but whose story continued to affect the natural landscape she had briefly inhabited. The final chapter of Lenore Duvalier's story came in 2005 when advanced DNA testing became available for historical remains. With permission from state authorities, samples from the skeleton found beneath the bridge were compared with genetic material from descendants of the Beaufort family in Haiti who had maintained oral traditions about an ancestor's lost fiancé in Florida. The results confirmed what circumstantial evidence had long suggested. The remains were indeed those of Lenore Duvalier. A proper burial was finally conducted, with a memorial service attended by Beaufort's great-great-grandchildren and representatives from historical societies in both Pensacola and New Orleans. The simple headstone in St. Michael's Cemetery bears only her name, dates of birth and death, and a line in French that Martin Beaufort had included in his letter to the territorial governor. Truth, like water, always finds its way. Today, visitors to the nature preserve that encompasses the former Magnolia Hill plantation can walk trails that pass near the foundations of the old house, now barely visible beneath vegetation. A small historical marker acknowledges both the site's antebellum past and the specific tragedy of Lenore Duvalier, ensuring that her story remains part of the public record rather than hidden away like Judge Patterson's papers or Eleanor's childhood diary. Academics continue to study the case as an example of how historical crimes can be partially reconstructed through fragmentary evidence and how systems of power and privilege operated to conceal violence against marginalized individuals. The Duvalier-Layton case is now included in university curricula focusing on historical justice, forensic archaeology, and the complicated legacies of America's antebellum period. Perhaps the most meaningful legacy of this historical tragedy is its demonstration of how truth persists despite attempts to silence it. From Eleanor's decades of mute witness to Martha Lewis's hidden journal entries, from Judge Patterson's preserved papers to the physical evidence that emerged from creek and bay, each fragment of the story survived to eventually form a coherent whole, giving voice to a woman who had been denied justice in her lifetime. As darkness falls over Escambia Bay and the waters reflect the same moon that shone on that November night in 1837, one might imagine Lenore Duvalier finally at rest, her story told, her remains properly honored. Yet local fishermen still sometimes speak of hearing a woman's voice on certain autumn nights, calling not in fear or anger but as if in warning, a reminder that some tragedies, though long past, continue to resonate across time, demanding that we listen to their lessons. For in the silences of history, in the spaces between official records and acknowledged narratives, lie countless stories like Lenora's, stories of lives cut short, of justice delayed or denied, of witnesses silenced by trauma or convention. It is only by attending to these silences, by seeking out the hidden testimonies and forgotten evidence, that we can begin to construct a more complete and honest account of our shared past. The most disturbing aspect of the Magnolia Hill mystery is not the violence itself, tragic though it was, but the ease with which it was concealed, the complicity of respected community members in maintaining that concealment, and the systemic barriers that prevented the truth from emerging during the lifetimes of those involved. As you walk away from this narrative, remember that for every historical mystery that has been partially resolved, countless others remain buried in unmarked graves, locked in forgotten archives, or preserved only in the unwritten memories of those who were not permitted to speak their truth. The past is never truly past. It continues to shape our present in ways both obvious and subtle. The waters of Escambia Bay still flow beneath the modern bridge that replaced the wooden structure where Lenora spent her final moments. They carry with them sediment and secrets, memories and mysteries, continuously connecting past to present in their endless journey toward the waiting Gulf. And if, standing on that bridge at dusk, you happen to feel a sudden chill or hear what sounds like distant weeping, perhaps it is not merely the wind or water, but history itself, speaking in the only voice it has, waiting for those willing to listen and remember.